Hello, my name is Sean Ulmer. I'm Executive Director at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. I want to thank you for joining me today for another in our series of art chats. This is a series of periodic conversations that we have with artists who are currently on view at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. Today, we're going to be speaking with Mary Zeran, who does have a piece in a current exhibition, Beyond the Object, Women Working in Abstraction. Mary was also the subject of a solo exhibition we did in 2020, which looked at a 10-year span of Mary's work. It was celebrating her 10th anniversary as working as a full-time professional artist. And we slotted that exhibition in 2020 as a part of our big lineup of exhibitions that we did to celebrate the museum's 125th anniversary. We wanted to make sure that one of the exhibition slots for that anniversary year was dedicated to a local artist because local artists have been part and parcel of the Cedar Rapids Museum's 125-year history from the very beginning. And so we wanted to make sure that as we celebrated our own anniversary, we made sure that we were celebrating one of our local artists. And it just happened to beautifully coincide with Mary's 10th anniversary. Sadly, 2020 was not a great year for museum visitorship. With the pandemic, we had fewer than desired people to see Mary's really fantastic show. But if you were one of the fortunate ones to see it, it really was an exceptional opportunity to look at the evolution of Mary's work over the course of 10 years. For those of you already familiar with Mary's work, one of which you can see floating above her head, there is, there it is, there we go. It is, she's a woman who works in abstraction. And oftentimes people don't notice evolutionary changes in abstract artists' work. But that show, that particular exhibition, really, I think, fully demonstrated how Mary has grown as an artist, what has changed over the course of those 10 years, and by having work from that full span on view, it was very, very informative and revealing to see that work. Now, in 2025, we are 5 years later in Mary's career. So now we're celebrating her 15th anniversary working as a full-time professional artist. And so it seemed like a great occasion to sit down with Mary and have a little bit of chat about her work and to make that as part of our Art Chats series. So welcome, Mary. I'm glad that you were able to join today, and I appreciate your willingness to explore your work with audience to provide context for the works that people encounter, either at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art or in one of the galleries that represents your work, or even if they're fortunate enough to encounter it in your studio. Which is always a completely different way to experience your work. So why don't we just go ahead and get started at the very beginning. How did you get interested in art in the first place?
First of all, let me say thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. So, well, my family, we all just made stuff. I didn't at the time know that we were artists or anything, but my mom made stuff and my grandma made stuff. And we were always encouraged to just make stuff. And it could be like found object stuff or painting, or I remember I made a bunch of pot holders as a child. It was just always making something. And so it was just part of my family history. But when I went to college, I was going to study journalism. And one of the things they wanted you to do was have a second major. And I thought, I really like magazines, so I'll just go to the art school and learn about art. I think I thought I was going to be in fashion, which is hilarious because I am not what you would consider a fashion plate. But so took an elective of metalworking and jewelry making. And when I was walking up the hill after my class, I thought, oh my God, this is amazing. I feel like I can do this. I know what I should be doing. I know I should be an artist. And so I dropped out of journalism school and became a art major and didn't tell my parents for like six months or something.
Where was this? Was this at the University of Iowa?
This was at University of Iowa, and my main professor was Chung Hee Chu. Yeah.
And so were there, I assume she was an influence upon you because she obviously caused you to change your major. Um, but were there other influences? I assume your family, you were mentioning that it was influential, especially as a very young artist. But were there other influences that came to bear on you as you matured as an artist?
Well, I always loved Kandinsky as a painter and Paul Klee, and I liked the Blue Rider group. I think it's because of the color. And then I liked Ava Hess for sculpture. And yeah, I tended to like more visceral kinds of things. I thought Joseph Beuys was pretty fabulous too. So,
So you started out in metalworking. How did you migrate from metalworking to painting?
well, I had a bad experience that I got really sick from all the chemicals and the it gave me really bad asthma and I got bronchitis and ended up with walking pneumonia. And so I realized that because I have asthma, I better not do soldering and things like that anymore. So for the last year of my major, I decided to just work with found objects. I worked with a lot of hair and sawdust and plexiglass instead. And fortunately, my major professor, Chung, he didn't care what you made. She just wanted you to make stuff. So it wasn't, like a huge deal. The weird part about it was that I thought I was going to be this metalsmith, and make my career as this metal worker. And I had to kind of take a step to the left, about face kind of thing. And so there was a few moments of devastation about like, what am I going to do with my life? Oh no, but I just kind of pulled out of it. So I did that did the found object sculpture for a really long time. And then I did installation work. And then I started doing painting because it's a lot easier to store because sculpture is cumbersome and it takes often you have to see it in the round. So I started painting because I was like, well, it's a flat thing you can put on a wall.
Or stack one against the other for
Yes,
space?
exactly. Stack them up in piles.
Well, I mean, it's interesting to hear you talk about moving from metalwork to found object work, but but that's, you know, hair. Did you say hair, plexiglass, sawdust? Did you say that? I mean,
Yep.
those are not necessarily better materials for somebody with, with asthma, I imagine. There's still issues there. I imagine that getting to painting probably was very helpful to you from a health perspective.
Well, yeah, and the thing is, I work with acrylics, so I have a solvent-free studio, so I don't have to worry about fumes or anything like that. So it's a lot better for me when it comes to like my asthma and stuff. I also got tendonitis in my wrists, and so I couldn't do a lot of the stuff that one would do in metalworking because my wrists would hurt. So I think my body was just telling me, forget about it. You're going to be doing something else.
Telling you to move on, move on.
That's
So,
right.
so when you did move on, what kind of painting were you doing initially?
Well, I was doing abstract landscape work. And then I was painting on, I pretty much started painting on Duralar straight away when I
For people
started
who don't know
painting.
what Duralar is, can you tell people what Duralar is?
So it's an archival polyester film that I think they make pop bottles out of it. And I started working on that because the canvas and everything was not slippery enough. It the drag was too much and I didn't enjoy that. I wanted to be able to have the paint really move quickly. So I saw someone else working on it and I thought, well, what is that? And so I got some and I've kind of been in love with it ever since.
And how long ago would you say that was?
15 years ago.
Okay, so about the time that you became a full-time professional artist.
Yes. Well, I was working as a display artist at a local department store, and I got really burnt out and one day ran screaming from the facility. And I woke up the next morning and my husband asked me what I was going to do, and I said, I'm going to be an artist. So, yeah, it was kind of I mean, I have my MFA, so it wasn't like it just came out of the blue, like I'm going to be an artist. I've never made art before in my life. It wasn't one of those deals, but I just decided to quit working for the man and make art.
Yeah, you had cred. Okay, so you
Yeah, I had a little cred. Yeah.
had a little cred. So you said, okay, I'm going to make the leap of faith. But you had this really big aha moment.
Yes, I did. Yeah. I was just like, ah, everybody thinks that being a display artist is going to be really glamorous and everything, but by the time you put up like 40 Christmas trees and 30 wreaths, it's not glamorous anymore. So I had to escape that job.
So explain to us or share with us how your work, would you say, how your work has evolved over the last 15 years?
Well, so I used to paint on plastic and then cut it up and arrange the pieces like collage. And everything was very bold colored and organic feeling with these straight edges. And I took a ceramics class and I had to learn how to decorate things. And all of a sudden I thought, wow, I don't need to be cutting things up anymore. I can just paint straight out and not be all confused and not worried so much about making these perfect cuts and making these perfect arrangements and things. So now I'm making paintings that are more about all over pattern and how the colors intermingle with each other.
One of the things I realized in looking at the exhibition we did 5 years ago, that sort of just spanned the first 10 years of your full-time work, was how scale of work changed over the course of those 10 years, how some of the earliest pieces were quite small and then they grew in size, and that was just one of the evolutions I think I saw in that particular exhibition. Can you talk a little bit about scale and how important that is to your work?
Well, I don't really, I love working on small things and I love working on big things. But with the when I first started painting, the mechanics of gluing all that plexiglass, all that plastic together was kind of an engineering feat to get bigger. I had to I had to come up with the right adhesives and figure out how to make it all work so that I could make the adhesive stick and stuff in the right way. This is not making a ton of sense,
No,
but
I know. I
but
get what
I
you're saying.
really loved those like little intimate spaces because it wasn't so much about technique, it was more about just the image. But then I love working on big things because it's more of a physical experience and more of about gesture and moving your arms at the very length, you're going like this instead of like this. And there's something really exciting about that.
Well, I was thinking, before, this conversation, I can't remember the exact moment when we met, but I know it was a long time ago, and shortly after your return to Cedar Rapids, and I remember that work then was on the smaller side. It was smaller scale, and you were doing some really, really fascinating things in that 6 by 6 inch size or that 12 by 12 inch size on cradle panel. And I remember I distinctly remember a conversation that we had as you were moving bigger. We had an interesting conversation, I thought, about how that required a different kind of mark making.
Mm.
That you couldn't do on a big scale all the tiny marks that you were making for your smaller pieces, that they would just make the big piece just look busy and overly frenetic. But that you needed, as you were saying, that ability to make a very big gesture. And that you couldn't do a big gesture on a small piece in the same way that you couldn't have a whole bunch of little small marks on a big piece. It wasn't going to be aesthetically pleasing, to the kind of things that you were investigating, but that you were really exploring and very excited about what the larger pieces offered you that was so different than what the smaller pieces did.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's really exciting to make giant brush strokes. Used to have a brush that was this wide, and I would load it up with paint and just because a lot of my pieces used to be individual strokes that I would glue together. So it was really fun to make these giant brush strokes that I couldn't make with those little tiny brushes. There are certain things I do in my process because I do a lot of dripping of pigment into a liquid format, or like a gel medium or something like that, that I can only make a mark of a certain size. It just won't go any bigger. And sometimes that can be kind of frustrating with what I'm doing right now. But I've learned how to work around it in a way.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, there are certain things you can control, and there's certain things you cannot control. And some of them, the resultant pores, for example, can't necessarily be big, or they're not going to work big. And so you're have to work around what the medium allows you to do. And it's interesting that this evolution, and it's not a linear evolution. I don't mean to imply that you went from small to big. You still work small. You also work big. But I think initially you were primarily working small, and until you figured out what gestures you needed to create to make your bigger pieces. You were doing so in your home studio, which was located a relatively small space in the basement of your home. And here you were in this relatively small space exploring what it meant to paint big, which I thought was even more amazing, considering how big your studio is now compared to what you had to work with through most of your career so far.
Well, yeah, there was also this fear factor too. I think like to work big, it takes a certain amount of courage, or maybe not courage, but not worrying about screwing up, because there's so much more material at stake. And to be willing to take up that amount of space, say I'm going to occupy this amount of square footage is it's a leap of faith, but it's also you have to have a certain amount of confidence. And I feel like the longer I've worked, the more confident I am, but maybe also the less I care about screwing up. So it that was something I had to work through too, was I really wanted to work big, partially because I thought real painters work big, but also I had to just kind of push through a whole bunch of insecurity about the whole thing.
Yeah, well, it's a major commitment of materials, and
Yeah.
materials cost money. And like, what if this doesn't work? I'm stuck with all the stuff that doesn't work, and I just put all this money into it. And considering that, that particular studio space was small. I mean, it was, in your basement, it was a small space. A big work looks twice as big in that small space as it does, say, on a big like museum wall. And they were really big then, but you've gone even bigger in many cases. And in fact, in the exhibition at the museum in 2020, you did a wall installation that went really from almost from floor to ceiling and probably about, I would guess, about 18 feet wide or something like that.
Yeah, I think that piece was it was like 19 feet wide by God, how tall was that thing?
It was pretty tall. I forget what our hang height is there, but you went up pretty far on the
Yeah,
walls.
yeah. I had to rent a space to make that piece. And then I also had to figure out how to make that piece. And it was like I said, a whole engineering thing. But it was really fun to step into that and see what happened because I made all these, I basically took rolls of Duralar and just painted on like 84-inch strips and longer. And so I had to figure out how to paint on something that large and keep the pigment moving. And it was more like running up one end and down the other, which is kind of what I'm doing now is when I'm painting, I'm squirting from bottles and I'm running and squirting and then running and squirting. And it had to also figure out, can you do it from standing up down on the floor, or do you have to be on a table, or, what's the distance? And yeah, it was really fun to figure it out.
And
And
you need
then
bigger
the
brushes.
piece, well, I was gonna say the piece was funny because I rolled it up and took it in a box like this big, and then I showed up and undid it. And that was fun to then roll it back up.
Mhm. Yeah, it was really a kind of phenomenal, sort of like the exclamation point on the exhibition, where you should sort of see where you were 10 years before and how you grew. And of course, we talked about size. That was only one of the factors where I saw a growth. There was also a lot of evolution, I think, in the shapes
Yes.
that you were creating and in the palette. The palette changed several times. So there was, uh, I talk about how those shapes have changed over time. You began by saying that there were, you gave us a sense of where you were, 15 years ago, with the biomorphic forms with the sharp edges. But talk about how the various shapes slash gestures have changed over time.
Well, at first they were organic shapes, but they had a very strong edge on them because I was cutting them out. And there would be just straight rectangles and things like that were something that I could build onto each other. Like this piece, you can kind of see how there's these straight lines and then these organic shapes. But I always had these pieces that I considered like my specialty fabric, where I would paint very organically, and it would be almost like bleeding of the paint all over the Duralar, and then I would cut those out in a shape. And so I would sometimes cut around where the bleeding was and let the paint tell me what the shape should be. But now, since I'm not cutting things out anymore, it's just totally about the bleed. And there's a lot of stripes in my work that are just all very vertical with large blossoms of color. So those are the forms that are happening now.
Would you say that that's been the primary development since the 2020 show?
Yeah, yeah, I would say so. And, I think the thing for me was that I was really insecure about painting. I didn't think that I could actually paint. And then I took that ceramic class, and like I said, I had to learn how to decorate things. And I was like, oh, and then I started to look at those paintings I would make that I would cut up. And I thought, well, why am I cutting these up? These paintings hold, they ring true to me as just plain paintings. Maybe I need to quit feeling so insecure about my painting ability and just actually put some time into exploring just painting. So I put my scissors away, and that's kind of what I've been doing from now on, is not cutting things up.
Yeah, we've over the years that we've known each other, we've talked a lot about, your work and I know that there's been times where, and it's true of every artist, where you're like, I don't know if I should go in this direction. I don't know if I should explore this. I'm I'm good at this. I'm good at this thing over here. And should I just continue to stay in my lane, or should I get out of my lane and try something different? And I'm a big advocate for pushing people outside their lanes a little bit, and said, I remember several conversations where we said, yeah, I would say, try it. If you don't like it, stick it under the bed, and pull it out in 3 years. I bet you find something in there that you like in 3 years that you might not like initially, because there's usually a germ of an idea sitting inside there. There's something that's encouraging you to explore. And I think, over the course of your career, I have seen where you've been less and less um, nervous about trying something new. I mean, just jumping into ceramics, for example, was a huge new thing, right? And thinking,
Yeah.
how do I take my aesthetic, my vision, and apply it to ceramics, which is extraordinarily challenging in many ways. But you just could have jumped right into the deep end there, and started exploring it, and it in turn has rewarded your painting. And the
Exactly.
same with you were doing monotypes. You explored monotype printmaking, and that required a different way of thinking and approaching the work that has now rewarded your painting.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, I don't think you ever go wrong by taking a chance. I think also sometimes people say something and it sticks in your brain. And one time you were at my studio and you said we were looking at one of the pieces that I had painted that was waiting to be cut up. And you were like, someone needs to take this away from you before you cut it up. And I thought, oh, okay,
Yes.
there's some permission. There's a little permission to just go ahead and paint. Yeah, so that was a good statement.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, sometimes, no offense, sometimes artists don't know when to stop.
Yeah,
Um, Looking at something is perfectly great, and they think it needs something else, and in some cases you can, you know, paint over and bring it back again, but in many cases you can't. Once a cut's made, it's made, right?
yep,
So yeah, sometimes people just need to hear that what they've done is really very good and shouldn't be messed with. And oftentimes, artists are so in the moment, or they're so in the zone, they don't necessarily see it from an outsider's set of eyes. Now, that's not to say that you can't explore whatever that impetus was, maybe just not with that piece. Leave that alone and start over again with another piece, and maybe do that bit of exploration. But yeah, there's it's when you're in it, you don't necessarily see it in the same way that everyone else does. I understand that you have a few slides that you could share with us today that kind of looks at a little bit of the trajectory of your career.
here we go. This is the tricky part. Okay,
Okay.
so I thought we'd start out with an example of the metalworking I did. And this was called Farm Flatware, and it was sterling silver, and it was influenced by farming implements like shovels and rakes and plows. And everything was built to be good for left-handed people because I felt like most righties eat so fast that they don't taste their food. And so I made it left-handed so people who are right-handed would have to slow down. This is a little brag piece. Chung Hee Chu had a husband who would buy art from students and then donate it to museums, and she donated this one to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So it's in
Oh,
their basement somewhere, just
well,
floating around.
I'm sure it's on view from time to time.
I don't know. But yeah. So this piece is a triptych, and this is the piece that's currently in the show right now at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. And this was a real breakthrough piece for me because it worked. And in this one, you can see how I'm making all these individual little brush strokes. and little squirty marks and things like that. And I would basically paint brush strokes on plastic, brush stroke after brush stroke after brush stroke, and then I'd cut them out and assemble them. So like all of these are individuals glued on each other.
And I can say, since it is on view, I can encourage people to come to the museum and take a look at it. It's rather small here on the screen. It's not a huge piece. They are small,
No,
small panels. They're 12 by 12s. But when you get up close, you allow yourself to get up close to them and see they're really quite complex layered compositions. And there's I often say there's a there's a what's the right word? There's a deceptive simplicity to your work,
right.
where people see it and they say, okay, I get it, right? But they don't realize that there are 150 ways each of these panels could have gone wrong. And because here you're cutting them out and you're assembling them like a collage and then putting them down. There are many different ways this could be. And I know from knowing your working method that you tried most of those different ways before you decided this is how it needs to be. This is how it needs to lay down. And so there are a lot of ways in which by just moving something an inch or two, it will ruin the composition. It'll throw the balance off. I mean, there's a lot of fundamental art principles at play here, but it's not about that. But those things need to be working for the composition to be successful, to be visually satisfying, to be engaging. And I think that, like most of your work, if you allow yourself the time to look at the work carefully, to embrace its complexity, that you get past that sense of simplicity, which is so very deceptive, I think. And this is one triptych that so accurately displays that.
Yeah, I don't really, I think the work that I'm making now is more complex, but I do actually prefer simplicity. I find otherwise it's just too overwhelming for me to have lots of stuff going on. I'm always trying to get rid of things and make things more like direct.
Yeah, and simplicity is a relative term. Okay, so what's simple to me may not be simple to you, and vice versa.
Right.
But I think that, I don't think any of your work is simple. I think
Right.
it's all
No,
quite
no.
complex, but there are degrees. There are degrees of intensity there. So this work feels very different from the triptych that we just looked at.
And this piece is 48 by 60. And this is one that I made in my basement. And, the thing about working this large in a small basement studio, which was what, probably 400 square feet at the most, is that you only can work on one piece at a time, And so, but this one is definitely about stretching out and exploring in a kind of explosive way, which I always love that idea of having a center point that you're exploding out from.
And one thing we really haven't talked about is that the piece that we've seen so far, the two pieces we've seen so far, and there'll be others coming up, are on cradled panel. These are
Right,
not pieces on canvas. You're not adhering these to canvas. So you're adhering them to this large wooden panel, which then you have to get out of your basement.
right, exactly.
Was a challenge in and of itself. But it's rigid. It doesn't bend. It's not going to
Right.
flex on you. And it's heavier than painting on canvas of its size. So you got all of the cumbersomeness that comes with the dimensions here, but then you've also got the weight. Uh,
Yes, exactly. And I'll tell you that 15 years later, these cradles are a lot heavier than they used to be, even though the weight hasn't changed. So
I
here's
hear you.
here's another 60 by 48-inch one. And here you can see where I'm using my giant brush to make a giant brush stroke, and then another giant brush stroke, and another giant brush stroke. So,
See,
and
and
then
here,
I make these with a bottle. And so um, I needed a bottle that had a wide enough mouth on it, so I got a mustard bottle, and that worked out really well to make these.
See, in here, I think the palette has completely changed from the first
Right.
pieces that you showed us. There's been a change in palette, which we haven't talked about yet. Oh, we talked about scale and shapes and forms, but we haven't really talked about the palette. And we haven't talked about the importance of white space.
Right. Well, I always felt like I was making really flat sculpture, like I was making an object within this picture plane. And so the white space was super important because it showed the edges of the sculptural piece.
And I think also the layering that you do really helps to underscore that three-dimensionality of this sort of flattened sculpture,
Right.
because it does definitely read that way.
Well, because it's assembling. It's all about assembling things, which is basically essentially what I had always done. I mean, as a kid, I was always gluing rocks onto things or gluing fabric onto things, and then metalsmithing is assembling things. So it it's all kind of the same idea of cutting and then gluing things together. So this is when I really start this, there's a shift that happens and I really start to get interested in pattern. And so I'm playing a lot with these different forms like polka dots, and then I'm playing with stripes. My colors have become more primary, but then there are some of these subtle things like this mint green, which isn't primary. And I'm also seeing how many different kinds of polka dots I can make.
And there's a structure to this that's completely different feel from the last image, for example. And this has got a lot more, much more geometry in it, melded with the biomorphic.
Yes. And well, my house came with a giant paper cutter. And so I love using that paper cutter. And so I'd make these thick, multi-layered pieces of plastic that I could cut up. I felt like it was like fabric, and I would just cut it with my paper cutter. And so I really liked that activity. So that's where those straight lines kind of came out.
Did you buy the house for the paper cutter? Is that what that was
That's
about?
right. That's right. The paper cutter stayed. So this is an example of one of the pieces that probably could have been just a fine painting on itself, but I cut it up, and you can kind of see where I followed some lines of the paint in that. I also started using wood grain as a mark because I like that idea of how wood grain tells the history of something. And I also like how patterns are repeated in nature. Like wood grain is very similar to the way a salmon flesh looks like when you cut it open. So I like that idea of pattern repeating itself.
And I know you've always layered, but here you really get a sense of three dimension in the way that you've stacked these and layered these various levels.
I also included my love of gardening. I often thought of these as almost like lily leaves or something like that, or iris leaves, or do you know what I mean? Kind of a reference to nature, since I really felt like this work was very landscape oriented, but not in a traditional, like always horizon line and clouds up here, but like maybe the forms were jumbled up. So this is one of the last pieces I made that was like this with the cutouts and the layering. And this one is 36 by 48. And there's a lot of, I started to think about this form as like wind moving over the landscape. And then you can also see more of these pieces that were cut out of a big piece of big painting that probably should have been left just as a big painting. And lots of mixing of patterns and different organic shapes.
Talk a little bit about that pale blue teal, that yeah, that outline form. I saw some of that in some of your print work.
Yeah, so this was basically it was left over after I cut out the inside thing. I was like, "Oh, that's a really great line." And so I wanted to add more I'd always used those squirty lines, but I wanted something a little bit more controlled and a little bit more graphic. So I started cutting these really narrow lines out of solid sheets and putting them on top of these compositions. And they kind of, for me, referenced clouds. So this is more like the work I'm making now. And it's all about these blooms of color and how the pigment interacts with each other to create different colors. When I was doing this, though, what I was also doing was I was painting on a piece of plastic in one color and then painting on another piece of plastic in another color and then gluing them all together to create these layered forms. And this one was the same deal where this was probably like six different pieces of plastic glued together. And this one's 48 by 48. So these blobs were about as big as I could get to make that, form. This was one of my classic marks, but it was very difficult to get those any bigger than that.
So let me ask you, when you're working on this scale, these big ones, there's some elements you can control, but then there are other elements you cannot. I mean, you kind of know this blob isn't going to get any bigger than this, but you don't know what exact shape it's going to take, right? I mean, there's a certain letting go that has to happen in the process. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, I kind of, like you say, I kind of know what's going to happen, but I also have to be willing to just let it happen. And I usually don't even know exactly what the painting is going to look like until the next day because there's a lot of so I'm painting on a flat table and then I'm putting down some gel medium and then I'm covering it with a ton of water and I'm dripping into the water and my tables are angled so that one corner is lower than the rest of them. So there's a lot of movement so I can get it set, but then after I leave the room, everything may shift and go down to the one corner. So like I say, I don't always know whether it's going to be a good painting till the next day.
Would you say that that's similar in some ways to working in ceramics?
Yeah. Oh, sure, because you never know what's going to happen with ceramics.
Until you
Yeah.
fire it and you pull it out of the kiln and you say, oh, okay, that turned out, or oh, that one didn't.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And usually with ceramics, it's kind of like, oh, that didn't turn out the way I thought it was going to look.
I mean, you
But
have over years and years, potters, they kind of have an idea how it's going to turn out. There are certain things they can control, the glazes they choose, on what kind of clay. They have an idea at this temperature, it's going to do something like this, right? Through years of experience, something like this. But then you just never really know until you put it in there because all kinds of things can affect the outcome. How close it is to the piece next to it, how quickly or something heats up or cools down. There's so many variable factors. You don't know until you actually open the kiln. Same way, you don't know until you come in the next day exactly what has happened with your piece of Duralar.
well, there's something really freeing about that. I mean, it's scary. Don't get me wrong, it's scary because I can have a ton of waste. Like I can paint and paint and paint and have so many failures, but you just paint over top of it. But you know what I mean? It's a lot of waste, but you also, when you have to learn to just let go and let it do its thing. And there's something pretty freeing about that once you can not feel like you have to control everything.
And then in a piece like this, where you might have 6 layers, one atop the other, you're kind of exercising control again
Yes.
because you're choosing these 6 layers. I mean, you probably have hundreds of different layers you could lay atop one another, and they won't all work, and they won't all look like this when you're done. So you're choosing from. I assume you have a stock of sheets that you've made that you use as your materials when assembling a piece like this.
Right, right. Yeah, I have a in my studio I have you know how in closets there are those shelf things with the rail, the closet rail, is that what it's called? The closet rod. I have two of those in my studio attached to the wall, and then I just hang these strips of Duralar that have been painted on there in a colorized way, so like yellow, pink, red, orange, blue, green, you know, in that way. And yeah, I can pick and choose what I want to layer. But I'm not even doing that anymore. Now I'm just painting straight on the Duralar. So, for instance, I will, on one side, I will paint this wood grain situation. And then on the other side, because Duralar is transparent, I will go in and paint this on top of that. So I'm not even gluing things together anymore.
But there's a great danger in this, in a way. I mean, because you can paint a fabulous back and then screw the front up.
Right, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Not that you ever would, of course.
Oh, that's right. I'd never screw it up. But no, I mean, yeah, it's like I said, that whole thing about letting go, where you have to be paying attention too. You know, like these are really easy to overdo, and I have to be very careful.
Sometimes you
And
got to take the scissors away.
yeah, you got to take the scissors away. That is right. So, and I included this one because it's one of my biggest paintings yet. I've been working on these paintings that are 72 inches by 48 inches, and they're monsters. Um, I can't even get them in my car, so I don't even know what I was thinking, but it's very fun to work on something this large.
You got to strap them to the top of your car,
Yeah, exactly. Did
driving through rapids.
So I have a great Yves Klein story about that. So one of my friends lived in New York City, and he was friends with Yves Klein, not Yves Klein. God, okay, now I can't even remember who it was. It was a very famous painter. And she had to move one of his paintings from the storage unit to her apartment. And he was like friends with Roscoe, famous kind of guy, right? And they strapped it to the top of a taxi cab and drove this big ass painting through New York City to move it from the storage unit to the apartment. You know, it was like seriously like strapping a Roscoe to the top of a taxi cab. And it's,
I, I think we need to find you a better solution than that.
I kind of love that though, you know?
Oh, it's a great story. It's a great story. But yeah, you come up with
Especially
other stories for yourself. Yeah, you don't
Especially if
need.
I could remember who the painter was. Maybe it was, no, never mind.
Well, I know we've got just a little bit of time left, but I'd like to open it up for questions. But before I do so, I just thought it might be nice. My last question to you would be, what excites you right now about your work? What are you most excited about right now?
Well, paint, color excites me. Color, I just think is the most thrilling thing. And then I love seeing the colors that happen when you mix one color with another. I mean, it's pretty simple, it's pretty basic, but um, yeah, I'm just always thrilled by different color combinations and the kind of emotions that they create.
Just sounds like you're still exploring.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I love the idea of that it is just a constant exploration and a constant evolution. I'm not really all that interested in creating pieces that look like the piece before.
So we've got an exciting next 5 years to
Yes,
see where
exactly.
you go next. Yeah,
Yeah, we'll
see
see
how.
what happens.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So at this point, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask Mary. And now's your chance.
Is there someone typed something in the chat, maybe? Oh, Melissa says so beautiful. Thank you, Melissa.
Anyone have any questions?
Mary, I had a question. This is Julie.
Hey,
How are you?
I'm good. How about you?
Pretty good. Thank you so much for sharing. Um, I know you were talking a little bit about with the earlier pieces, cutting things up and having that feel kind of like cutting up fabric. And I think I remember hearing you talk about the women in your family,
Right.
with textiles or with fiber. And so I'm wondering, even with the pieces, the more recent pieces where you're still layering things, does that still feel like it's also kind of coming out of almost like a fabric or a fiber tradition?
Yeah, well, so fabric has been really important to me because my mom made all my clothes when I was growing up, and I would go to the fabric stores with her. And it just felt like so much creativity and freedom to be able to have your clothes made for you, to be able to pick what you wanted and stuff. And so in the past, the work felt like I was cutting up things to make something else, almost like cutting out like a sleeve shape or something, or a pocket shape or something like that. And now I feel like I'm making the fabric. So, because I'm laying out, I'm unrolling, I have these pieces of Duralar that are 24 inches wide by 50 feet long, huge rolls, and I roll out 84 inches and then I paint on this 84 inches and then I cut those up and make my pieces. I choose within that 84 inches what I want to have the painting be. But so yeah, I feel like I am basically doing large pieces of tie-dye.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Mary,
Yep.
so jumping off of that last question, have you ever considered working with textiles?
Well, I tried to do some textile work, God, maybe about 10 years ago, but I found it really frustrating because the pigment got soaked up by the fabric, so it didn't move and flow as much, where the plastic really gives me a lot more working time. So I do design a collection of scarves, which is about the closest I get to actually doing textile work.
Now that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, I think I'd rather just have someone else do the textile work for me.
Any other questions? Well, Mary, thank you so very much for your time and for sharing with us some of your work and your evolution as an artist. It's been a delight to hear you talk about how you've grown as an artist and being able to see that in your work. And as I said earlier, we look forward to seeing what comes next from you.
Yo, thank you so much for having me. This was really fun. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you all for joining us. This recording will be added to the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art's YouTube channel. There you can find other art chats with other artists, as well as episodes from our Grantwood in Focus series and our One Night Stand series. So please check out any or all of those. They're there for your viewing pleasure, and we look forward to you joining us again in the future. So thank you all so very much.
Thanks, Sean.